Elena Rybakina has spent years staring down the hardest hitters in the entire WTA. We are talking about players who can overpower almost anyone on any surface. These are the athletes who make a rally feel completely hopeless after just 3 shots. But when things moved to Rome, something strange started happening. There were moments where Alex Eala actually made Rybakina look uncomfortable on clay. It was a sight fans honestly did not expect to see. This was not just about one lucky point or a single surprising winner. She looked genuinely uncomfortable. The scary part is that most people still have not noticed what really changed. If you only watched the highlights, you probably saw the obvious stuff first. You saw the big forehands, the quick movement, and the confidence. You heard the crowd exploding after those long rallies. But underneath all that noise, there was something much bigger quietly happening point after point. Alex Eala was suddenly playing clay court tennis like a completely different player. That is the kind of shift that should not happen this quickly, especially when you are standing across the net from someone like Elena Rybakina. Rybakina is exactly the type of player who makes young opponents panic on the dirt. Her power forces you backward. Her pace ruins your timing. Her depth slowly suffocates you until a rally stops feeling like a sport and starts feeling like survival. For a long time, clay looked like the one surface that could potentially slow Alex Eala down. That was the assumption everyone made. People pointed to the slower movement, the heavier rallies, and the physical grinding. All of it seemed perfectly designed to expose the weakest parts of a young, aggressive player still learning how to manage elite pace. But Rome suddenly flipped that entire narrative upside down. The weird part was not even the result itself. It was the energy inside the match. You could feel it through the screen. Every time Eala stepped inside the baseline, the crowd reacted before the point was even over. Every time she absorbed Rybakina's pace and redirected the ball early, the stadium got louder. Little by little, something unusual started happening to the rhythm of the match. Rybakina stopped looking fully in control. That is the specific detail people cannot stop thinking about. This was not supposed to be the surface where Alex Eala could pressure one of the most dangerous power players in the world. Yet somehow, rally after rally, she kept creating problems that simply did not exist before. So what exactly changed? Was this just one hot performance in Rome? Or did Alex Eala quietly unlock something on clay that could change how the rest of the WTA looks at her moving forward? Once you slow the match down and really examine what happened, you start noticing patterns that are honestly hard to ignore. But to understand why Rome suddenly felt different, you first have to understand what clay used to do to Alex Eala. Clay exposes everything. It shows the world your footwork, your patience, your recovery speed, and your emotional control. Every tiny weakness becomes visible the longer a rally lasts. For a long time, clay looked like the surface that might slow her down instead of elevating her. It was not because she lacked talent. Nobody ever questioned her talent. The shot-making was obvious from the start. We saw the timing, the left-handed patterns, and the ability to redirect pace cleanly. Even against stronger opponents, you could see flashes of a player with extremely high-level instincts. But clay does not care about flashes. Clay forces you to survive long enough to prove those flashes are real. That is what makes the surface so brutal for young, aggressive players. It is especially hard for players whose games are built around timing and early ball striking. On hard courts, you can sometimes take control quickly. The court rewards clean contact, the ball stays lower, and your timing feels sharper. You can steal momentum fast. Clay is different. Clay slows everything down just enough to make your life miserable. It gives opponents more time to defend and more time to reset the point. It gives them more time to expose your movement. One bad recovery step suddenly turns into a defensive scramble 3 shots later. That is why so many young players struggle during their transition onto the dirt. The surface forces you to grow up emotionally. You cannot rush your way through it. Honestly, there were moments in earlier clay matches where Alex Eala still looked caught between 2 identities. You could see her instincts telling her to attack early, but you could also see hesitation creeping in once rallies became physical. Sometimes she drifted too far behind the baseline. Sometimes her movement became reactive instead of proactive. Sometimes the patience just disappeared at the exact moment the pressure increased. It was not a disaster, but it was just enough to remind you she was still learning how to fully trust herself on this surface. That is exactly what made Rome feel so shocking. Elena Rybakina is probably one of the worst possible opponents to face if your clay court confidence is still fragile. Rybakina does not just beat players physically, she suffocates their rhythm. Her pace comes through the court differently from almost anyone else on tour. Even on slower surfaces, her ball still feels heavy and deep. It forces rushed decisions. Once she starts controlling the middle of the court, opponents usually begin retreating almost automatically. That is the trap. One extra defensive step backward turns into two, and then two turns into three. Suddenly, the rally is happening on Rybakina's terms instead of yours. That is why Rome should have been uncomfortable for Eala. On paper, this looked like a matchup where experience and raw power would slowly wear her down. But something strange happened instead. The more the match continued, the more Alex Eala stopped looking like a player trying to survive. She started looking like somebody trying to take control. That shift is massive. Controlling a rally on clay is not only about hitting harder, it is about controlling space, height, and timing. It is about controlling the emotional pressure between shots. Little by little, Rome revealed that Eala was handling those layers differently. Her body language looked calmer. Her footwork looked cleaner. Even after losing points, she kept stepping forward instead of retreating. That is not normal growth for 1 week. That looks more like a player beginning to understand the surface at a completely different level. Once fans in Rome started sensing that confidence, the atmosphere inside the stadium changed too. The crowd was not reacting like they were watching a lucky underdog. They reacted like they were witnessing a real transformation happening live in front of them. Tennis fans can feel fear, but they can also feel the moment a player stops playing scared. If you were watching, you probably felt that same energy shift. It was that strange feeling that Alex Eala was somehow dictating parts of a clay court battle against one of the cleanest power hitters in the sport. The craziest part is that the biggest clue was sitting right in front of everyone the entire time. It was not the winners, it was where she was standing. The first thing that jumped out in Rome was her court position. Against heavy hitters on clay, younger players usually drift backward. Sometimes they do not even realize they are doing it. The pressure slowly pushes them deeper behind the baseline until every rally becomes about defensive survival. That is normally what Rybakina does to people. She compresses your reaction time so aggressively that you start creating distance just to breathe. One step backward feels safe at first, but then you are defending from 3 meters back while she controls the center. In Rome, Eala kept doing the opposite. She kept stepping in. Once you notice it, you cannot unsee it for the rest of the match. There were rallies where Rybakina unloaded one of those deep, heavy ground strokes that usually force people back immediately. Instead of retreating, Eala absorbed the pace early and redirected the ball before Rybakina could even reset. That changes everything. The moment you take the ball earlier on clay, you remove time from your opponent. You interrupt their rhythm. You stop the point from becoming comfortable. Suddenly, Rybakina looked slightly rushed in situations where she normally looks completely calm. She was not panicked, but she was uncomfortable enough for the dynamic to change. One rally showed it perfectly. Rybakina pushed Eala wide with depth that usually creates a defensive reset. Earlier in her career, Eala probably would have floated that next shot high just to survive. But in Rome, she recovered her balance quickly, stepped forward again, and redirected the next ball deep through the middle before Rybakina could attack. The crowd exploded. It was not just because it was a flashy point, it was because people recognized the confidence. Tennis crowds are smarter than people think, especially in Rome. They can feel when a player is no longer reacting out of fear. The deeper the match went, the more that feeling kept growing. Then another pattern started appearing. She was no longer allowing Rybakina to end rallies on comfortable terms. That sounds simple, but it is huge against someone with that kind of power. Most opponents against elite hitters slowly accept shorter points emotionally. They start forcing low-percentage shots because they are afraid long rallies will eventually crush them. Eala did not look emotionally rushed in Rome. She looked patient without becoming passive. That balance is incredibly difficult on clay. There were points where she absorbed 3 heavy blows in a row, stayed balanced, and then suddenly changed direction earlier than expected. Instead of surviving the rally, she subtly flipped the pressure back onto Rybakina. The stadium got louder every time Eala stood her ground near the baseline. That is not accidental. Fans react to bravery in tennis. They love seeing a player refuse to give away court position against a bigger hitter, but here is where the mystery becomes even more interesting. Positioning alone does not explain this. Standing closer to the baseline means nothing if your timing breaks down. In fact, it usually becomes a disaster on clay because bad footwork gets punished even harder when the surface is slow. So why did Eala suddenly trust her timing enough to play this aggressively? Why did she stop looking rushed after long rallies? Why did her movement look calmer, even when Rybakina increased the pace? These are the questions that matter because this was not random shot-making. This looked repeatable. That is what started making the match feel genuinely dangerous for the rest of the WTA. Once a young player begins trusting her positioning on clay, the entire geometry of her game changes. Angles open earlier, redirects become cleaner, and opponents lose their comfort zone. You could actually see moments where Rybakina seemed surprised by how quickly the ball kept coming back deep. That usually does not happen against inexperienced clay players. But Rome kept producing these strange little moments where Eala looked more certain of herself, with every difficult rally. The confidence never disappeared after mistakes. Earlier in her career, one mistimed aggressive shot might have triggered hesitation for the next few points. That is normal for younger players because clay punishes impatience so brutally. Once doubt enters your movement, everything slows down mentally. In Rome, Eala missed shots and still stepped forward again immediately afterward. That is a massive psychological signal. It tells you the player is no longer testing an idea. She is beginning to believe in it. Once that belief becomes real, the entire match changes emotionally for both players. Now the opponent starts feeling the pressure too. The deeper revelation was not really about positioning at all. It was about what was happening inside Alex Eala's mindset. Here is the part most people missed. Alex Eala was not just moving better. She suddenly stopped looking afraid of the surface itself. That changes the entire emotional structure of a match. For younger players, clay can become psychological very fast. The rallies feel longer, and the points feel heavier. Mistakes linger in your head because every exchange requires more work. Against someone like Elena Rybakina, that pressure multiplies. Most players walk onto the court already understanding how dangerous her pace can become. There is usually a subconscious fear sitting in the back of their minds. They wonder if they can physically survive that level for long enough. They wonder if they will break down mentally. That fear changes your decisions. It changes where you stand and how you breathe. For years, that has been a hidden advantage for elite power players. They do not only beat you with the racket, they slowly convince you that resistance is pointless. But Rome did not feel like that. Eala was not playing like somebody trying to avoid disaster. She was playing like somebody trying to create discomfort for her opponent. That is a completely different mentality. There is a moment during high-level matches where players stop reacting and start imposing. You can feel the shift when it happens. The body language changes first, then the shot tolerance changes, and suddenly the underdog no longer looks grateful just to be there. They start looking dangerous. Earlier in her development, difficult rallies on clay looked like negotiations. You could sense her trying to balance aggression with caution. But against Rybakina, that hesitation looked dramatically smaller. Even after exhausting exchanges, Eala kept showing the willingness to step inside the court again. It says your power is not controlling me anymore. Once a power hitter starts feeling that resistance, frustration quietly enters the match. It is the kind of frustration where extra shots suddenly feel annoying. You realize the person across the net is not emotionally shrinking anymore. Rome was not only showing technical growth, it was showing emotional stability against elite pace. That might matter even more long-term. Mechanics and fitness can improve, but learning how to stay mentally forward against elite pressure is a much harder evolution. You could see it between points. After mistakes, Eala did not stare at her box in frustration. She did not carry panic into the next rally. Even when Rybakina landed heavy shots, Eala kept resetting and stepping back into an aggressive position. Earlier versions of Alex Eala on clay sometimes looked like a player running beside the match trying to keep up. In Rome, she suddenly looked like she was holding part of the steering wheel. She had enough control to change the emotional balance of the rallies. She had enough control to force a clean hitter like Rybakina into uncomfortable exchanges. If you felt that watching the match, I want to know, did you sense that she looked mentally different in Rome? Because that might be the biggest clue about her future. Players usually do not develop this kind of belief overnight. It comes from months of invisible adjustments that nobody notices until everything finally clicks. Once you go back and watch the Rome match carefully, the evidence is everywhere. The rallies were telling the story before the commentators even caught up. Rybakina normally takes over physical exchanges, but Eala kept interrupting that sequence. She would absorb heavy pace, recover her balance, and stop Rybakina from attacking the open space. On clay, how you move after the first defensive shot decides the next 3 shots. In the past, Eala looked vulnerable during those moments. In Rome, it looked calmer and more intentional. That is not just confidence. It is adaptation. The strongest proof appeared on return games. Returning against Elena Rybakina is miserable even on fast courts. On clay, the extra bounce makes the timing even more uncomfortable. But Eala was not just trying to survive the first shot. She kept looking for ways to neutralize the point immediately. She repeatedly tried to direct the ball deep to prevent Rybakina from controlling the next shot. Eala refused to accept a defensive role. Slowly, you could feel Rybakina getting dragged into uncomfortable patterns. It was not because Eala was physically stronger, but because she stopped allowing the match to follow the expected emotional script. Her recovery after being pushed wide was sharper. Her hips reset faster, and her balance looked more controlled. That changes the geometry of a rally. Now, opponents do not see the same open spaces. They need one extra quality shot to finish the point. In pro tennis, one extra shot is exhausting. Rome fans know clay tennis. They understand when someone is just surviving versus when someone is competing on equal terms. That is why the applause sounded different for Eala. It was not polite support for an underdog. It sounded like recognition. It was recognition that a dangerous version of Alex Eala might be forming much earlier than anyone expected. The older version of Eala sometimes looked caught between identities. She was too aggressive to grind, but too cautious to fully trust her positioning. Rome looked more connected. The decisions were quicker, and the emotional resets were faster. Most importantly, her aggressive instincts did not disappear after a few hard points. Young players often lose their identity on clay before they figure the surface out. The court forces hesitation into your game until you learn how to blend patience with aggression. Eala suddenly looked closer to solving that puzzle. People still talk about Alex Eala mostly as a hard court talent. But what happens if clay becomes a true weapon? What happens if her movement keeps improving while her timing stays this aggressive? That ceiling starts looking very different. Left-handed players who control the rhythm on clay are incredibly annoying matchups at the highest level. The crowd in Rome was reacting to a visible transformation. They were watching the exact moment potential starts turning into belief. Point by point, people realized she was no longer playing like a prospect. She was playing like someone who expects to belong. Maybe the real story from Rome was not the final score. Maybe the story is that the surface people thought would slow her down might become her biggest strength. What shocked Elena Rybakina was not raw power, it was transformation. Alex Eala suddenly looked like a player who understood how to stay emotionally aggressive on clay without losing control. The positioning changed, the movement changed, and the belief changed. Belief changes everything at the highest level. You can see the moment when players stop hoping they belong and start expecting to win. Rome felt like one of those moments. It was recognition from the crowd, from her opponent, and from the tennis world. Alex Eala is evolving faster than expected on a surface that usually takes years to master. That should make the rest of the WTA very uncomfortable. If she keeps developing this way, she will not just be dangerous on fast courts. She will be the type of player who can disrupt anyone, anywhere. Clay teaches you patience and emotional control. Once a young player absorbs those lessons, that growth spreads to every other surface. We may eventually look back at this match and realize we were watching the beginning of a completely different stage in her career. The exciting part is that she still looks unfinished. There are still physical gains and tactical layers to come. The version that pushed Rybakina in Rome is not even her final form. If she is already this stable against elite pace, what happens a year from now? What happens after a few more full clay seasons? That is the question Rome left hanging over the tour. This will not be the last time a crowd reacts to Alex Eala like they are witnessing the future in real time. Rome was not the end of a breakthrough story. It was the warning sign before the real rise begins.